Welcome everyone to Grand Rounds. Before introducing today's speaker, I want to complete our land acknowledgement. We take the time to recognize that we are currently teaching, learning, and caring for others on their traditional territories shared between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Nations, which was acknowledged in the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant. That wampum uses the symbolism of a dish to represent the territory and one spoon to represent that those who use the land are to share the resources of that land and take only what they need. It's my great privilege to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Natasha Johnson. Dr. Johnson is the Associate Chair, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and Professor within the Department of Pediatrics at McMaster University and McMaster's Children's Hospital here in Ontario. She's also the chair of diversity and inclusion for the Undergraduate Medical Education program at McMaster University and president-elect of the Canadian Pediatric Society. A passionate advocate for children, youth, and families affected by racism and other types of oppression, she works with pediatric leadership and community partners to guide a strategic vision to promote anti-oppression and anti-racism. She is the 2018 recipient of the Pat Mandy Inclusion Award for outstanding contributions towards the inclusion and support of gender diverse youth, and a 2023 recipient of the YWCA Women of Distinction Award for her work supporting equity deserving populations and marginalized youth, and her impact on the Hamilton community. In 2016, she established a clinical service providing gender affirming care to trans and gender diverse youth and their families, the first of its kind at McMaster's Children's Hospital, which in 2022 received generous donor funding and expansion support. As a founding member of the Anti-Racism Coalition in the Department of Pediatrics at McMaster, she continues to lead transformative change in healthcare with a focus on marginalized youth, those who have been historically oppressed, and equity-deserving populations. She recently completed the University of British Columbia's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Certificate Program in early 2023. Natasha's parents immigrated to Canada from Jamaica. She was born and raised in Montreal, where she did her medical training and where her parents still live. She is a single mother to 2 teen boys. Dr. Johnson, it's a pleasure to have you join us today. I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. Actually, one of my boys is no longer a teen. He's 21 years of age and just finishing his first university degree. I mentioned that I'm thrilled to be here today when I was invited to do these rounds in celebration of Black History Month by Dr. Suzanne Archie. I said, of course, because it was her who asked me. And in addition to a respected colleague, and collaborator, she has become a trusted advisor, mentor, and role model. But then the weight of the responsibility set in on me. What do I share with this learned group of folks who are all committed to mental health? What can I share about racialized folks that will resonate, that they'll take away with them, and most importantly, will affect their interactions with patients, families, learners, and colleagues? It is a heavy responsibility. Some people look at me and are not aware that in addition to my academic and professional accomplishments, I belong to a group that experiences differential outcomes across the board in health systems, educational systems, carceral systems. And sadly, my professional degrees and awards, as well as finances, are no antidotes to the systems that lead to these outcomes. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Hopefully, I can get us to embrace the dialectic. We are all doing the best we can, and it's not good enough. So I wanted to, in addition to the land acknowledgement that was already provided, acknowledge with gratitude the Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, myself, those who continue to thrive and resist colonial violence while striving for self-determination and decolonial futures. I remember my own ancestors, forcibly displanted Africans brought to Turtle Island as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, and the histories and legacies of colonialism and neocolonialism, which continue to impact African peoples and the descendants of the Black diaspora across the world. I recognize that racial colonial violence harms Black, Afro-Indigenous, and Indigenous peoples through both common and distinct pathways, I recognize my responsibility as the daughter of uninvited immigrant settlers from Jamaica to be a good guest on these lands. I don't have any financial disclosures or commercial disclosures, but there are some disclosures that I do wish to make. I recognize that as a straight, cisgender, non-disabled person who is a pediatrician working at a large academic center, that I am in a position of power and privilege relative to many. Sorry, my tongue's getting tied. As a Black woman, the intersection of my race, gender, and socioeconomic status impacts this positionality. My Blackness impacts the way that I experience the world and the way that people experience me. I do not pretend to represent the perspective of all Black people or all people of color. I am committed to listening to comments and concerns regarding my presentation, and my contact information was shared at the beginning of this talk on the first slide. So you've already seen, hopefully, the objectives as they were circulated with the Grand Rounds flyer invitation. As the title of my presentation indicates, and because it's Black History Month, I'll be focusing on anti-Black racism as that is my lived experience. I understand and recognize, though, that it's not the only form of racism or oppression. At the same time, it is worth acknowledging that even here in Canada, where race-based data is collected, Black and Indigenous peoples tend to have the worst outcomes. This includes in all of the systems I mentioned before, health systems, educational systems, carceral systems. And it is not because there are any significant genetic differences between the babies that are pictured on this slide. So I don't think any good talk nowadays can be given without at least acknowledging AI. And I use AI in this presentation. I was curious about what the racial disparities are in psychiatry. And so I went to Open Evidence, I typed that in, and I got pages and pages of information. So I could actually just read those pages to you, and that would be the end of the Grand Rounds. But I decided not to do that. I am going to highlight, however, certain disparities that are thematically grouped. And so there are diagnostic disparities, there are treatment and access utilization disparities, there are coercive treatment setting disparities, there's disparity as it relates to suicide risk, and there are also disparities in workforce and research gaps. So I'm going to give a few examples under each of those categories before moving on. In terms of diagnostic disparities, Black children are significantly underdiagnosed with internalizing conditions, especially anxiety, depression, and overdiagnosed with conduct problems compared to white children, even after controlling for socioeconomic factors. BIPOC youth experience delayed diagnosis and treatment of autism spectrum disorder, overdiagnosis of conduct disorder, and underdiagnosis of ADHD. These diagnostic patterns reflect assessment bias by clinicians and racialized clinical descriptors that disproportionately attribute hostility and behavioral problems to Black children. Schizophrenia and psychotic disorders are overdiagnosed. And in terms of treatment and access utilization disparities, BIPOC individuals received lower quality psychiatric care across multiple dimensions. Black patients are more likely to be treated with first-generation antipsychotics, receive higher medication doses, and long-acting injectable formulations compared to their white counterparts. Access barriers disproportionately affect minoritized populations. With respect to coercive treatment settings, we know that BIPOC individuals are overrepresented in restrictive treatment environments. They are more likely to receive care in emergency department and inpatient settings. They are more likely to have police involvement during transport, experience physical restraints, and undergo involuntary treatment. Suicide risk is also disparate in terms of the numbers. Black children aged 5 to 7 have suicide rates nearly twice as high as white children, and suicide attempt rates among Black adolescent girls have been increasing disproportionately. Despite this elevated risk, Black and multiracial adolescents are least likely to receive preventive psychotherapy. As it relates to workforce and research gaps, we know by looking around at our institutions that there is underrepresentation of BIPOC clinicians in the mental health workforce. And this contributes to outcome inequities as physicians of color are more likely to care for underserved patients. Additionally, psychiatric research has historically studied predominantly white populations, which leads to overgeneralized physiologic findings and treatment that may be less effective for racial and ethnic minority individuals. In fact, the American Psychiatric Association has acknowledged these systemic issues and called for actionable recommendations to eliminate structural racism throughout psychiatry. So instead of reading the several pages that I got when I asked the query of open evidence, I decided I would use a bunch of different tactics and intersperse this talk with some social media. If you follow me on any of the platforms that I listed on the first slide, you know that what I say in this slide is true. I post a random mix of sweet babies, cute cats, daily life, anti-repression, anti-racism topics, and also I do swear sometimes. So before I move any further in this talk, it's interesting. Every time I give these types of talks and review the data, it affects me profoundly. In addition to that, I do have social anxiety. So anytime I give a talk like this, I get very nervous. It is getting better though with exposure, so I'll continue to do that. And it's also better because I know there's a number of friends, friendly faces in the audience, although I can't see you. So this is a collage of some of the important people in my inner circle. So I think you can see my pointer. So this top picture here is me and my eldest son. This is me and my youngest son. This was us sort of in the top left at my sister's wedding many years ago. So we were all dolled up. The bottom left, you can see my dad displaying his culinary skills with lobster to the boys. My mom and I at the airport in Jamaica having a reunion. My dad trying to enlist one of his grandsons to love golf like he and I do. My two sisters at the bottom. And then on the right, you see well, three boys actually. So two biological sons and one of my best friend's sons. And they pretty much grew up together. And I still have this picture as a screensaver on my phone because I love it so much. And sorry, I'm just going to go back to that collage for just a second because for these types of talks, in addition to the social anxiety, I also get really nervous about fulfilling any stereotypes, in particular that of the angry Black women. And so some of the statistics that I've mentioned already should cause people to be angry. They certainly cause me to be angry. But I have to moderate that feeling so as not to fulfill stereotypes. And also, I don't want people to focus on the delivery of my talk, but I want them to focus on the content of my talk. So I'm trying my best to stay grounded and neutral, even though the content of these rounds is pretty upsetting for me and for those I love. For some of you, I will be the only Black attending physician that you ever work with or hear giving grand rounds. This slide reminds me of a few things, including to thank Megan Lacey, who is the EDI coordinator extraordinaire for the Department of Pediatrics and who is my right-hand person and keeps me on task. Their help, as well as the help of Blake Caden, who is responsible for comms and UGME, allowed me to embed Instagram posts to my talk today. In this clip, you will hear Blair Imani talking about racism and health.
Have you ever thought about how the threat of experiencing racism is a chronic source of stress? Let's get smarter in seconds about the many ways that racism can end you.
Most of us know that racism can be deadly in the form of physical violence, medical neglect, and environmental racism.
But when going to work means facing microaggressions, driving home means potential negative interactions with the police, and tuning into the news means seeing people from your own community being harassed, you're also stuck in an environment where the stress from racism is impossible to avoid.
We know that when you experience stress, hormones like cortisol and adrenaline are released into your body.
Over time, these hormones can weaken the immune system, disrupt digestion, and alter brain chemistry linked to mood, sleep, and anxiety.
A recent study following Black and white adults over many years tracked blood markers of inflammation, which is a biological signal of chronic stress.
They found that lifelong stress and inflammation may explain why Black life expectancies are shorter than white life expectancies. So much so that the average white person is expected to live around 3 years longer than the average Black person.
This isn't because white people have superior biology that helps them live longer or stress less. In fact, that belief is racist.
Research has also established a strong link between experiences of racism and a variety of adverse mental health outcomes, including
depression, anxiety, suicide risk, PTSD, and more.
Don't write this off as hurt feelings. This is about physiological responses to psychological harm.
In fact, racial trauma is defined as a psychological injury resulting from experiences of racial bias, ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes.
The mental and physical impacts of a lifetime of experiencing racism have been thoroughly researched and documented, and the conclusions are clear. Racism is deadly, which is why fighting racism is life-saving work.
Smarter in seconds.
Right. Thank you, Blair and Imani, for that.
Have
I'm
you
going to
ever thought
share
about
with you some more Insta content. Here it is, Dr. Joel Burville, who is also known as the medical mythbuster as it relates to healthcare and healthcare disparities. In this clip, he describes an episode of The Pit, which I'm sure some of you watch. The Pit is an American medical procedural drama, which is current. It's sort of like a modern day version of ER with my favorite, Dr. Well, I'm going to call him Dr. Noah Wiley, but he's not actually a doctor, actor Noah Wiley. So let's go.
What if the way a patient's treated before doctors ever see them determines their entire care? In this week's episode of The Pit, we see that happen when we're introduced to Jackson, a Black law student, like this.
Out of college kid, flipped down the library, tased in the neck by campus security, 5 midazolam, didn't touch him.
Get the fuck off me, 2901! 2901, motherfucker, get up! Fuck you!
Tell me some more about your ideas?
Flipped out, tased by campus security, given 5-midazolam, a sedative, and it didn't touch him. Before anyone checks his labs or speaks to him or his parents, a narrative has already been written. What The Pit captures here is something I see reflected in my real life as a doctor and is supported by research. Research like this has found that Black patients have a 30% higher risk of being physically restrained in emergency departments when compared to white patients having similar psychiatric emergencies. And in the US, mental health crises are often handled by law enforcement before healthcare. That changes how someone is perceived the moment they enter the system. By the time Jackson arrives at the hospital, he isn't just a patient in crisis. He's been framed. But episode 7 also shifts the story.
Jackson is on an involuntary psych hold.
What? That's not necessary.
He just needs some rest. He's been studying for the bar exam. We can watch him at home. So far, all of his tests look good, but Jackson has reported hearing voices. This could be serious.
His parents are understandably confused and upset. Jackson's been placed on an involuntary psychiatric hold for his own safety. His labs and everything are normal, but then this simple question is asked.
Either of you have a family history of mental illness?
Not mine.
My brother took his own life.
Wait, what? Uncle Ken?
Suddenly, Jackson's story isn't about an angry Black kid. It's about silence, stigma, and a history that was never named. In medicine, we're trained to treat symptoms, but really what we inherit are stories. And the first story told about a patient, especially one in crisis, can lead everything that follows. To me, that's why Jackson's storyline is so important to watch. Because sometimes the most powerful intervention isn't a medication. It's pausing long enough to ask the right question. What if the
Okay, so this slide illustrates some important concepts that I learned through the Kojo Institute. Kika Ojo shared these slides with myself and some other colleagues and allowed us to share this information more broadly. So Kika told us about the legacies that were written about by Anne Bishop. And in this slide, you can see illustrated that health outcomes and other things, including policies, laws, and values, are all influenced by foundational legacies at the bottom. And the foundational legacies are, and I'm going to read them so that everybody remembers them because they continue to have an impact today. The foundational legacies are patriarchy, colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, capitalism, the theft and conquest of the Americas, and religious universalism and the Crusades. Legacies are structures of dominance, and we are all impacted by them, but we're impacted differently due to our various identities. The legacies cause us as a society to assign more value to certain types of people. So, for example, patriarchy values cisgender men over cisgender women, and both of those groups over children and two LGBTQIA plus community members. Colonialism values Western European, typically, over others. The transatlantic slave trade values white over Black. Capitalism values having money and land over not having that. The theft and conquest of the Americas values settlers over indigenous peoples. And religious universalism and the Crusades value Christianity over other religions. The values create the invisible structures that uphold the legacies. The laws and the policies that are made embed these values into them. The reason that it's important for me to highlight these foundational legacies and their impact in terms of who you value or who we as a society tend to value is to make the invisible visible. And the purpose of that is the knowledge that we can't change or address what we cannot see. Understanding these legacies and the histories of Black people in Canada are key to understanding many myths, misconceptions, and differential outcomes. Also, academic outcomes are differential. We've talked a lot about health, but we'll talk about some of the academic disparities as well. And they persist here today in Canada at Hamilton Health Sciences Centre and also at McMaster University. I don't know if anybody else has seen this. If you heard me talk at a particular lecture, I think it was a year or two ago, you might have seen this slide. It was news to me that there were actually segregated schools in Canada. And this is a picture of one of those segregated schools. As the civil rights movement unfolded south of the border in the States, more than 50 elementary schools in rural Southwest Ontario were experiencing segregated schooling. I discovered that one of the most pressing issues in the 19th century was that public schools in many parts of Ontario refused to admit African Canadian children. In 1843, Paula Brown and other Black advocates in Hamilton wrote a letter to the Governor General at the time, stating that while we have paid the taxes, there are no steps taken to change this manner of discriminatory treatment in school. This advocacy had a significant impact, and eventually Black children were allowed to attend Hamilton public schools. This story is not unique to Hamilton, Ontario, and universities are not immune from the legacies of slavery and anti-Black racism. Unfortunately, medicine is rooted in anti-Black racism. The first medical schools in Canada were opening at a time when Black people were still enslaved in this country. People like Linnaeus in 1735 were describing the disposition of different groups of people, and he described the disposition of Black people, although in a terminology that we will no longer refer to. And in terms of Black people, they were described as being lazy, as having less intelligent, There are themes of us having different pain thresholds, and it was used to be taught in medical and nursing schools that we had different nerve endings, and that's why our pain thresholds were different. Many of you will have heard by now of the Tuskegee syphilis study, which ended in 1972, the year before I was born. And that study looked at the natural history of syphilis in poor Black sharecroppers in the southern United States at a time when the treatment for syphilis, penicillin, was easily accessible and available. So they held this treatment while watching the natural history and taking blood from these people under false pretenses. And there were a number of babies born with congenital syphilis, of course, over the course of this study as well. More recently, we've heard that oxygen saturation probes are unreliable or less reliable in darker pigmented skin. This context helps us understand that in 1918, Queen's University banned publicly people of African descent from entrance into medical school in support of the decision made by the American Medical Association. Fortunately, the ban ended in 1965. It wasn't until 2018 that Queen's removed the ban from their books, and in 2019, they formally apologized for their policies. They further acknowledged the hostile campus climate that was experienced by Black students, including veiled racist threats and mockery of fellow students. This is a picture of me and my classmates, the class of 1997, McGill University Medical class of 1997. I've highlighted myself and the two other Black students in that class, Dr. Marjorie Dixon, Dr. Hakeem Sam, and of the group of 139 students, we accounted for about 2% of the class. And this percentage was much lower than the percentage of Black people in the surrounding community in Montreal. A fairly recent study had similar results. Remember, I'm getting old now, and the class of 1997 was a long time ago, but a 2018 study looking at 14 medical schools across Canada found that 23 students out of the almost 1,400 identified as Black. And that was 1.7% of medical students self-identifying as Black. So essentially the same percentage, actually maybe a bit lower than the one I quoted from my medical class. So there is something about the persistence of this pattern across decades and across the country that speaks to the systemic barriers that continue to face Black students. If, as we talked about on one of those initial slides, there's nothing genetically different about the babies and their potential is all the same. This matters for reasons beyond equitable access for medical school seats. The mortality of Black infants in the United States is twice that of their white counterparts. Black women and Black birthing people have higher mortality than their white counterparts too. Socioeconomic status does not protect you. In fact, studies show that the richest Black birthing people have mortality that is worse than the poorest white women. Concordance for race, a Black baby being cared for by a Black pediatrician reduces their mortality by 58%. It's worth acknowledging here, again, the privilege that I have of being part of the medical profession and to be a physician, the first in my family. Last week, I had the opportunity to listen to a great talk by Dr. Madupe Tendai Bias, and she referred to the lonely only, a term which resonated with me deeply. There's something isolating and stressful about always being the only type of person on a team. I was always the only Black medical student, the only Black resident, fellow, on rotations throughout my training. In my profession, I'm typically not only the sole Black doctor, but the sole Black healthcare provider on the team. And I've worked on big teams. Up until a couple of years ago, in fact, on all the teams I've worked on as a staff, I was the sole Black member of the interdisciplinary team. Like no Black nurses, no psychologists, psychiatrists, CYWs, social workers, dietitians, NPs, managers, clinical leaders, directors, you name it, just me, the lonely only. And like Blair says, stress has a toll on bodies. It doesn't help to go through training where entire texts are devoid of people who look like you. Netter's anatomy textbook, which I'll refer to as the Bible of anatomy, and I'm not sure if they use another text now, but certainly it was our core anatomy text. In its over 500 pages, not a single person of color was represented in this text. And it wasn't until 2021, when Chitty Bear eBay's image of the Black fetus went viral, that many of us had seen ourselves represented in medical imagery at all. My sister says I personified the raised eye emoji here, and I agree with her. I felt compelled to share the fact that I have not yet met a woman in the academy who does not acknowledge the ongoing impact of the patriarchy and misogyny in academia. But many of these same women have trouble understanding the added layer of anti-Black racism and misogynoir that I experience. Trust me, folks, it's there. This is an infographic that was based on research from Dr. Melinda Smith, who published a study in 2019 looking at the compositional diversity of university leadership teams in order to assess the representation and status of women, Indigenous peoples, and racialized people. What they found that, and this will come as no surprise to anyone here, is that in spite of employment equity policies that have existed for decades, stated commitments to equity, diversity, and inclusion on websites, there was a significant disconnect between the rhetoric and actual practice. In fact, what was shown is that while there has been substantial progress made in reducing the gender gap at Canadian universities, leadership remains mainly white. And you can see from this slide, the greenish blue here is represents white men. The red represents white women. Visible minority men and women are represented in purple and orange, and Indigenous men and women are represented in green and yellow. So the graphic speaks for itself. I wanted to take a minute to speak to the pet to threat phenomenon, which was described here in Forbes magazine. And many mid to late career women of color experience, and it resonated pretty strongly with a lot of us, including myself. I will quote directly from this article. Those working in disciplines, roles, or organizations in which they were severely underrepresented seem to be at most risk for having early career experiences in which they are treated like pets. That is celebrated while being exploited for what one of our research participants called their diversity social capital, while also being underutilized for the knowledge, skill, ability, and experience they could provide. These professionals are often forced to consider looking for new employment or changing career paths altogether. Increasingly, many others are choosing an entrepreneurial route. More senior women who persisted in workplaces in which they likewise were severely underrepresented shared experiences in which peers seemed to treat them as though they were a threat. The threat these credentialed and experienced professionals seemed to pose was a threat to the status quo. It is well documented that senior women of color, and Black women in particular, do not reap the same rewards, like pay and recognition as their peers, that their leadership as well is chronically undermined. At the same time, service responsibilities, for example, office housework, are piled on in ways that derail their career mobility and undermine their health. These leaders often experience workplace alienation and isolation, and sometimes an erosion of support systems that were available earlier at pet stages of their career. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to listen to a book launch by Anahid Dashkard, and she is one of the CEOs of Annabelle Leadership. And they have a BIPOC leadership forum or module. And she recently wrote and launched this book, which is called Fire and Silence and is a roadmap for BIPOC leaders. In the launch, she read an excerpt from her book, which resonated deeply with me. She was reading it to racialized leaders, and I want to actually do the same. So from colonization to segregation to various waves of immigration, it's never been easy to enter leadership as a person of color. And this time of rising white nationalism across the Western world is another such period. Movements that push slogans such as anti-white racism and Make America Great Again, and their equivalents in other nations, are gaining traction around the world. If it was challenging pre-pandemic to name discrimination faced, it's even more challenging now, sometimes even dangerous. The unconscious racism in the workplace has become more visible in the scapegoating of BIPOC people. Those DEI hires are too uppity and they're asking for too much. They're taking jobs from us, or their incompetency is causing issues. Most recently, President Donald Trump and his far-right government cronies have blamed disasters such as the Potomac River airplane crash in Washington, a cargo ship hitting the Baltimore Bridge, and the Los Angeles wildfires on diversity hires or policies. Those of us who are working professionals of color also forge our careers in a system designed to privilege, recognize, and advance white excellence, with the unspoken attitude being, you're lucky to be here, rather than we're lucky to have you. Many of us grow up believing variations of feeling not enough. If you take nothing away else from these pages, just know that you are not the problem. So knowing all of the things that I've said so far, and that one of the antidotes to health disparities is race concordance, and I'd like to also posit one of the antidotes to academic disparities as well. Knowing this and knowing that systems were colluding to exclude Black people from medicine, Black scholars and their allies have been advocating for increased representation for decades. Probably a collision of many factors, including the murder of George Floyd in 2020, where many institutions were forced to reckon with their historical and ongoing harm to Black communities, led to actual action on a number of these initiatives moving forward. In November 2021, McMaster became a signatory to the Scarborough Charter on Anti-Black Racism and Black Inclusion in Higher Education. This charter identifies key barriers to inclusion and recommends concrete solutions that will address systemic racism and includes accountability measures for institutions. Around the same time, the Undergraduate Medical Education program developed a social accountability statement, and the mandate is listed on the slide. Two priority groups were identified, and that includes those who identify as Indigenous, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and those who identify with Black ancestry. So through the advocacy of a number of people, some of whom are listed on the slide, the African Caribbean Faculty Association of McMaster, Dr. Audrey Campbell, who was in my role at UGME before I was, Dr. Jason Profetter, who was the chair of admissions at that time, Their collaboration led to the launch of the Black Equity Stream, which is also known as BEST. And the BEST Stream received Senate approval in February 2022. The BEST Stream was modeled after the Facilitated Indigenous Application Stream, or FIAP, and important to note that students must meet the same minimum academic standards. They have to write a short personal essay, which is reviewed by a Black community consultation team. There are no designated or reserved spots, and this is one of a handful of facilitated entry programs across the country. Important to note that prior to BEST, there were 0 to 3 Black students in McMaster's Undergraduate Medical Education program. Since BEST, and I'll show the numbers on the next slide, in the class of 2026 that is graduating shortly, there were 17 BEST students. In the class of 2027, 14 BEST students, and in the class of 2028, 15 BEST students. And this represents about 6% of the total class and is much more closely aligned with the percentage of Black people in the general population. And so, in spite of everything that I mentioned before, the future is bright. One of the things that I have had the most pleasure in my time in EDI and IR work is having the opportunity to collaborate with and learn from Dr. Patricia Farrugia, who's the Associate Dean of Indigenous Health in the Faculty of Health Sciences, and also in the position of Chair Indigenous Health for UGME. And so the two of us, along with the students who are listed on the slide, recently published the article that is here, investigating the impact of educational backgrounds on medical students' perceptions of admission pathways within our medical school. And some takeaways from this study included there were calls for improved communication about admissions criteria and process. There were perceptions about fairness versus advancing social accountability. And there were concerns that pathways could unintentionally favor applicants with higher socioeconomic status. And so it's also interesting to note that those who had like sociology backgrounds were not any more likely to be accepting of these pathways than their counterparts who did not have such backgrounds. And the QR code, I believe, links you to the study. Hold on, just going forward. Okay, one of the important elements of EDIR work, or anti-racism, anti-oppression work, is self-work. And I definitely do that, working with my therapist, self-studying, learning more all the time, and self-preservation in order to prevent burnout. Nihilism is the enemy of this work, thinking that your efforts cannot and do not make a difference. I continue to remind myself that small changes matter. I want to both acknowledge the injustices that have been done to me and people who look like me, and not let that pull me into despair or cause me to dehumanize others. The Black Excellence Grad is a joyous time where Black graduates from across the university have been able to celebrate in community. I will show you this clip that gives a little taste of the energy and vibe of that day. I was pleased to be there with my friend and colleague, Dr. Natasha Johnson, to give a hug to the sole Black medical student who is graduating that year, as she proudly walked across the stage.
Jerusalema, ikayalami. Jerusalema, ikayalami, ilondoloze, uhambe nami.
Okay, so I want to end with this slide. I presented to my mom last night, as I always do before presentation, and she, as having been an English teacher, does not agree with the term woke because it's grammatically incorrect. Nonetheless, I did insist that I want hashtag woke and hashtag not an EDI hire on my tombstone and in my eulogy. While I do still sometimes do provide my credentials to be taken seriously, I'm starting to worry less about that and rest in the confidence that I am competent, actually beyond competent, in this beautiful Black body, and that in addition to the legacies of harm that it embodies resilience and strength. And with that, I will end and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. This facility does not allow for there to be applause, and it's super regrettable because I think you'd be hearing a lot of it probably on their feet. So thank you for that. One thing that I might put to you kind of in an overall sense is a lot of us are going to be moving on in minutes, frankly, to do the kind of, one at a time medicine, psychiatry, and mental health care. And the people that we see are kind of queued up for us. They've come through a process. And so, of course, there's that generic question of what can we all do to be allies and so on, right? Okay, but let's get to the questions. Sad to hear, this is from Lena Canella, that there was a segregated school on Concession Street in Hamilton in 1965. So yeah, it seems like you know about that.
Yeah. Sad to hear. And I was telling my mom when I did this presentation with her, that's part of how the foundational legacies are allowed to continue to have their impact, because there are many people who are unaware of Canada's racist histories or the fact that there were people enslaved in Canada. And that allows us to feign ignorance and to pretend that we are better than our colleagues south of the border, which we may be in some ways, but we do have a lot of work to do as well.
Okay, thank you. Sebasu Tilahones asking an interesting question, I think, interesting discussion. I feel that relatively speaking, I'm reading this verbatim.
Yeah.
Relatively speaking, Canada is doing better than most Western nations when it comes to the issue of racism. What are your thoughts? You mentioned Trump.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Okay. Well, it's hard not to be better than him. Okay. So I'll start with that. So we have a prime minister who I definitely respect. And I live in a country where there continue to be huge racial disparities. And so during the time of George Floyd and his murder, I went through a huge depression. It was very traumatic for me to see yet another unarmed Black man murdered in plain sight. And typically what happens is that people get the perpetrators are not punished, do not receive any punishment for that from a legal perspective. And I think a lot of people were saying, oh, we're better in Canada. And then I looked at the Ontario Human Rights Commission did a study, I believe it was 2018, that showed that first of all, that my Black sons are 20 times more likely than their white counterparts to die by police violence in the GTA in 2018. And in addition to that, while we make up about 8% of the population in Toronto, we account for 70% of fatal police shootings. And so do I live, work, and play in an environment where people are more polite to me and don't tend to use really negative language where it's frowned upon? Yes. And do health outcomes, carceral outcomes, education outcomes, do those continue to be very disparate, even here in Canada? 100%. I did an EDI certificate through the University of British Columbia
And part of that learning, there was a facilitator, a Black man who spent many years in different parts of the world. And he said that actually the racism in Canada, from his experience, was the worst because it's like where people smile in your face and then you don't know what's coming. So I think the answer to that question is yes and no. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Just a quick note to Sarah Daniel, who's asked a question, but I think it's cut off. There might have been a character limit. So Dr. Daniel is giving you high praise and has many questions. And the part that I can see is that she has liked your disclosure slide
Oh, great.
a lot. So Sarah, if you're out there, you can question. There's a big applause plus here, so that's great.
Yay.
So here's a question. It's long, so I'm going to try to. So again, just thank you. And this is about kind of your experience being the only Black doctor or Black healthcare provider in a multidisciplinary team. And an example when a non-Black team member in these settings either noticed or maybe didn't notice an unconscious bias and how that might have influenced healthcare outcomes for the patient.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, if that's putting you on the spot.
No, it's
Yeah.
not. So I know that I cry easily. I might cry. That's okay. I just embrace it. Who knows?
Okay.
So one of my very good friends and colleagues, I'm sure she's on the call, Dr. Jennifer Couturier, is a member of the Department of Psychiatry and was also my colleague and co-conspirator for 8 years when we co-led McMaster Children's Hospital's eating disorder program. And yeah, like after George Floyd's murder, maybe there's a Natasha before and after. Before, I had been conditioned to not speak about race and racism at work. It was very impolite and impolitic. It was clearly communicated that way. The word racism did not even appear on our pediatrics competency document. There were no images of Black people in our medical textbooks. And I would come in after the murder of another unarmed Black person, which could include children. And I would come to work and no one else seemed to be fazed by this, right? And so that happened until George Floyd. And with his death, like many, I felt compelled to now use my position of power and my voice to speak to the injustices that were faced by my community. And when I say community, I don't really see the border as the limit to the community. So my diasporic community. And so I started to talk about racism everywhere. And Dr. Jennifer Couturier heard a lot of me talking about this. And she listened to me and she asked me the question that you asked, like, how could I be an ally? How could I be a better ally? And so we were able to talk about that. You know, if I seem to be misportrayed as an angry Black woman, can you intervene? If somebody seems to be ignoring me, are you able to amplify my voice? Things like that. Checking in on me when something terrible happens, those types of things. One of my colleagues, too, I remember calling me after she had to admit a person who did not want to be admitted voluntarily, and the person happened to be Black. And it turned out that we needed security to escort this person to the unit, as happens sometimes in the healthcare we provide. It's rare, but it does happen sometimes. And that person reached out to me to ask me, you know, to sort of talk through it. We have used the restraints, and is there anything I can do in the face of this harm to provide more competent care, structurally competent care? And simply acknowledging to the mother what that must be like for her as a Black woman, knowing that there are different ways the system mistreats us, that can be really, really powerful. So those are some examples.
Okay, thank you. And this is from Dr. Archie, complimenting you and thanking you for your advocacy. And I think you've just been speaking a little bit to this, but she asks, what's some of the allyship work that still needs to be done at the clinical learning environment level?
Ooh.
Yeah.
Oh, Dr. Archie, I could talk for another probably 2 hours on that. One of the things I'll say is just like I mentioned in Dr. Melinda Smith's study, where universities are touting commitments to EDI, but actually in practice, you don't see changes in certain areas unless there are structural changes that accompany that. I work in a place that says there is zero tolerance to racism and discrimination. And that has not been my experience. Like overt, blatant, racist things happen. And the consequence is really not clear to me. I won't give you examples, but there are multiple examples. And so I think um, the institution has to have, as part of its leadership, Black people who are able to make decisions and implement policies and procedures that we think will be helpful. Because when you assign a person, a Black person, a role, but then do not give them any power or money, like it's like tokenistic, right? So we need to have people who are in positions of power to change policy and actually start to ask hospitals, how are you holding yourselves accountable to these statements of zero tolerance of discrimination and racism? These types of things I think need to be considered as part of accreditation moving forward. So that's one of my thoughts. But like I said, I could talk about that for a long time.
Next year?
Maybe.
Maybe. Okay. And there's so many compliments here, adjectives, like word clouds, humility, knowledge, candor, vulnerability, humanity. And I want to get back to Sarah Daniels' point, which is kind of complementing your disclosure slide and having other speakers kind of reflect on going a little bit deeper than just financial disclosures and thinking about their biases and such.
I've seen a number of my colleagues start to do that as well. They sometimes put a picture of the intersectionality wheel behind them when they talk about disclosures and acknowledge who they are. I think that's one of the ways that we can start to connect more across differences. So I think it's a good touch. It wasn't my idea. I don't know whose idea it was, but it wasn't mine.
Let me try to fit in one more. It's 9:58. So, what is your advice to preceptors and others to support Black identified medical students in pre and post clerkship? Maybe that's not a 2-minute question.
It's not a 2-minute question. Although I will say that not being the lonely only is an antidote in and of itself. So the community that I see these students creating, hanging out with Black students across campus, they are paired with mentors. I think checking in with them about how things are going and if there's anything in particular that can be done to be helpful, making sure that they're connected. Those are some of the things that come to the top of my mind. And needless to say, UGME, because I'm there currently, is focusing on exactly that. We don't want to welcome 17, 15, 14 new students a year who are then experiencing harm without any antidote. And so we are really trying to pay attention to the issues that come up. But I definitely think having more than 1 or 2 students per year is helpful in and of itself.
Okay. Thank you. I think we'll leave it there. Thanks again so much. An amazing talk, super inspiring. Wish everyone well and hope to see you all again next week. Okay. Thanks all. So long.
Thank you.